A silenced phone. A single knock at midnight that should have been nothing more than a stranger seeking directions. 3 shadowed figures at the gate, a van idling like a sleeping animal. They did not come for money. They came to erase a name. Jacob had been asleep on the couch, the television still muffling a late-night soap, when the first fist opened the door. The bedroom was the small, honest kind. A fan that rattled in humidity, a stack of greasy magazines on a battered toolbox, a child's drawing taped crookedly to the wall. Mariam stood at the sink, spooning warm water into a bowl for Helen, who had woken and refused to sleep alone. Jacob pushed himself up, voice rough with sleep. He thought at first it was a drunk neighbor, or a delivery. He thought wrong. The first of the men moved like someone practiced. A small, compact flashlight, a handkerchief over his mouth, the blunt edge of a baton before the words. "We don't want trouble," the man said, and the sound of his voice was flat, used to being believed. Jacob stepped between the doorway and the man, because for reasons he could not name in the moment, he would always try to protect the house he had built from nothing. Protecting was what he knew. Someone struck him across the ribs. The blow was precise enough to fold a man into silence. Helen started to wail. Mariam went to her, and the hitmen used the child's cry as permission to be crueler, to move faster. One of them shoved Jacob out into the courtyard. Another ransacked drawers, thumbed through old photographs as if looking for a paper to burn. They were careful with time. They moved with a purpose that was not theft. When they left, because they always left, it was with an exchange, a slap that left Jacob's face swollen, a threat murmured close to his ear. "Keep quiet, or next time we won't come in 2 men. The van's tail lights dissolved into the rainy night. Mariam wrapped a towel around Jacob's shoulders and pressed a cool palm to his sweating forehead. Helen clung to her leg, sucking the breath out of the room like she could stitch the pieces back together. Jacob's pride burned brighter than the pain. He sat on the steps and felt the old shame. The same shame that had lived in his chest since the hospital years ago. The one that had made him swallow threats and keep his mouth closed when Amanda's name came into conversation, because any mention of her pulled him backwards to what he could never properly explain. Across town, in an entirely different light, Amanda Okoro rocked the child on her lap and listened to the sound of the mansion. The house was large enough that emptiness could be measured there in rooms she never visited. She had filled corners with art and glass, and a quiet staff. She had filled calendars with meetings and foundations, and the mechanical private rituals of a woman who had fought for every inch of power she possessed. What she had not filled, could not fill, was a small palm closing around her thumb in the dark. Peter felt for the comfort he had learned at her breastless yet steady presence. He was 5 and blind, and trusted her like a tide. He hummed softly, a child's song she had invented, because lullabies felt like the only language that could be translated across the distance between wealth and need. Amanda hummed it back, because the sound of her own voice steadied her, because the hand that had raised him had also kept a distance from the truth. Amanda's phone vibrated on the side table. She did not look at it. Her house was wired in a way most people did not see until they needed it. Cameras mounted like eyes at the edges of the estate. A security team who understood the meaning of a minor ripple in the schedule. Her assistant had pressed importance into her inbox already that morning. A note that Jacob had not come to the garage in 2 days. A name she had not thought to call under ordinary circumstances. She had known Jacob's face since he was younger than he was now. She had watched him, in years when she gave small kindnesses, because she had been fickle and lonely, and because people she trusted had asked her to. She had never stopped knowing him. Her hand lifted and took the phone. There was a message. His number, short, unpunctuated, from hours ago. "We need to talk. They keep stopping by." She could feel the old pressure in her chest, an ache that had always been honesty about a bad choice. She called a number she kept for times when remoteness felt dangerous. A lean man named Tom, who ran a private security consultancy and had once saved her from a journalist who mistook privacy for ownership. "Check his last ping," she said, "and pull the street cams out by his workshop. Run a sweep for plates." Tom's reply came within minutes. "There's been something, Ms. Okoro. A ping consistent with a vehicle loitering at his address around midnight." Amanda did not tell Tom about the lullaby she had hummed to a blind child 20 feet away. She did not need to. She had raised blind Peter from the moment he was handed to her, so that he might have a life that would not be crushed under the weight of poverty. She had sent money quietly over the years to a man she had once loved, or thought she had loved, and to his family. She had pretended that was enough. Night after night, the cost of that pretense accumulated. In the morning, neighbors' phones filled with the cropped images of the assault. A blurred street camera shot of a van, a figure in a green jacket, legs sprinting away from the gate. There was a single clear thing in the grainy footage. The jacket belonged to Jacob, the man they'd beaten. The street camera had caught him retreating into the house with something clasped in his fist, something which he tucked into his shirt before the men burst the gate. Mariam told the neighbors that it had been the old family photograph he had been hiding after the debt collectors came. Only he knew it was a receipt, older than the house, a receipt for a letter of intent Amanda had once signed and never filed. Jacob lay in the small hospital ward with a towel pressed to his wounds. The emergency room stitched his split lip and scanned his bruised ribs. He answered the police with the particular reluctance of a man who believed any attention on him would ripple outward into danger for those he loved. His right hand trembled as he filled in names. The officer at the desk took notes, asked about enemies, about trades gone wrong, whether anything had been stolen. Jacob told them what his life had allowed, the names of men who owed him money on parts, the name of a contractor who had come by. He did not tell them the thing he had been carrying in his chest for 6 years, that his blood might belong to a woman whose house could buy any court in the country. He didn't say that he had once been to her dinner table because he feared the dangerous attention that truth would attract. Amanda watched the small storm unfold in pixels from screens in her study. Her security chief sent her the cropped neighborhood footage. It was ugly and small, like most truths. The van's license plate was illegible, but there was a shadow at the gate and a hand leaning down into the yard. A second clip from a nearby shop showed 3 men running toward the street. A man in a green jacket bending over as if to steady himself. She felt an old protective reflex. Not paternal, not maternal in the way the world used the word. This was a protective muscle that had developed from a complicated past. She had known Jacob too well. She knew that when he was afraid he doubted his right to be defended. She knew that he understood the coin of silence as both shield and shackle. She had not the right to step into their small family, but she had the means to draw the circle of help tighter around them. Tom alerted the local precinct and arranged for a patrol to shadow the van's last seen route. Amanda's contact at the hospital, a nurse who had once been grateful for a scholarship paid quiet and late, texted that Jacob had been admitted and that Mariam was with him. The world did what worlds do. It learned the perimeter of the pain and began to consider it as an item on a docket. Meanwhile, in a dusty townhouse at the edge of town, Amaka sat in a chair like someone taking stock of a harvest. She looked at her son Chisholm as a farmer might look at a plant that was not yet bending to his will. Chisholm's face had the lazy luxury of someone who had been allowed malice as training. He had avoided work the day had asked for it, cultivated a fierce boredom cultivated into cruel actions. They had come to know each other in ways that had mattered less to Amaka than the effective outcome of their collusion. She had not wanted to get her hands dirty. She liked blood as metaphor, not as substance. Chisholm's pockets jingled with cash. He had paid men to teach Jacob a lesson, to make silence more probable. He had done it thinking that fear could be turned into a commodity. He had called the men back and told them not to escalate, but he had not been taught how men like that measured success. He hadn't considered how an assault might spiral into something else, a police record, a PR nightmare, a trail that could be followed. "He's a mechanic," Chisholm said, chewing a toothpick. "He keeps old things. Maybe there's something worth finding. Maybe there's leverage." The grin he wore refracted into something colder than anger: entitlement. Amaka folded her hands in a steeple and considered the wheels she'd set in motion years ago. There was a ledger in her mental file labeled outcomes. The swap at the hospital had been a line item under that ledger, a small, terrible transaction justified by 1,000 whispered resentments. A sister who had always been taller in the world. A life of privileges Amanda had not known to fear because wealth insulated her in the way wealth does. Amaka had not expected the consequences to sediment into the lives of other people. She had imagined a distant fix. She had given a baby to the system and returned one to the woman who thought herself magnanimous. She had not expected a child in an orphanage to look at a future like a blank page and fill it with intelligence and hurt. Across town, in the narrow rooms of St. Mary's orphanage, Philip learned the economy of small things. He was clever in the ways of survival. He listened when adults left broadcast windows open and learned to steal the language adults used to hide shame. He was thin from the kind of hunger that erased the sense of luxury, and the orphanage smelled of bleach and old milk. The man who ran St. Mary's was tired in the way that men who had signed papers they could not explain become tired. He had kept a ledger of needs and promises, of donations and debts. He had been quietly pragmatic about the babies that came through his doors. Philip had been fortunate to have brains and a stubbornness that resisted being diminished by the scarcity around him. It would be easy, and small, to make Philip only the instrument of the story, to reduce him to revelation. Amanda would not let that happen. For both boys, there should be life beyond the mechanics of a betrayal. Even in the orphanage's dimness, Philip learned to read the minute things that signaled adults telling the truth. He made a friend with a volunteer who came on Tuesdays and handed him a dog-eared book. He read in the lamplight and imagined a world less cruel. Back in Jacob's neighborhood, the police knocked on doors and took statements. A neighbor provided a license plate fragment. A shopkeeper recalled the van's make. The officers drove the route again, hoping to catch the van in its habitual loop should it try to reclaim a sense of safety. One of the men they took into custody was a low-level runner, a man with tattoos and a fear that could be measured. In the corridor outside, an officer read from a list of charges, and the man's eyes darted to the floor as if the world had cracked open. The runner knew names, but not levels. He knew cash, not ledgers. He had been hired because his name was cheap, and because fear could be paid to scale. When the officers asked who had hired them, he spat a few obvious names that circled the margins. A boy named Chisholm, a woman who had once lived near Amanda's estates, a contractor who owed money to a cousin. The runner had given them a van plate that led to a compound of loan sharks and an address where men sold their dignity for a night's pay. The officers kept their notes measured. Legal procedure demanded that paper be thicker than inference. Amanda watched the thin lines of the investigation coil and then advance like a diver probing for oxygen in muck. There was satisfaction to be had in the movement of evidence. She had learned the value of patience watching money move through corrupt networks. Wait for the men to make the mistake of trusting the wrong ledger, of leaving a name on a receipt. She did not operate in the immediacy of the moment because she could instead afford to let the people's greed make the errors. But there were other things that immediate action required. She thought of Jacob at the hospital. There was a particular gait he used when he left his house to walk to the corner shop. She knew the street vendors he favored because she had watched him make change once for a child who had struck her with an off-key song. She knew that he slept in a room facing west, and that his daughter liked the strap of a faded backpack, and that when Jacob was afraid he would chew his thumbnail until it bled. These were not secrets to leverage. They were a map of a person who had been part of her life, however oblique. Amanda's first call that day was to a woman named Dr. Bello. She did not announce herself as Amanda Okoro at first, because she had learned that people changed when riches entered a conversation. She said Jacob's name and asked about his status. Doctor. Bello's voice grew careful. She was a doctor who balanced duty with the knowledge that hospitals were arenas where compassion became bureaucracy. He has non-life-threatening injuries, she said, but he is in pain. Make sure he's not discharged before he is stable, Amanda said, and tell the nurses not to release his personal effects. The line went quiet for a second, that felt like a hand finding a map. Who is this? Someone who cares that he is safe, Amanda said. When the line hung up, and Dr. Bello ticked a box on a medical chart she could not meet, Amanda felt the old ache that came with giving and being given the privilege of making choices on other people's behalf. Jacob woke late that afternoon to a different world. The truth had found him a shape. He had always imagined consequences would be simple, resolute, like a machine snapping. Instead, the world had the soft edges of legal bodies and the thin, sometimes indecipherable kindness of strangers. Mariam held his hand when she could. Helen drew pictures and pressed them at his arm. The bruises on his ribs told a story he refused to embellish. "You should have told me," Mariam said once the visitors had left, their eyes soft with something that felt like pity, but was not the same. Jacob wanted to explain the 1,000 ways a man protects a dignity too fragile to be exposed to the light. He wanted to say that he was ashamed of what Amanda had given him, ashamed of a child he might never claim openly for fear of the trouble his name would conjure. He wanted to tell Mariam that he had kept a fragment of a photograph in his shirt pocket against the day when perhaps a truth would be asked to stand, but he could not. Not yet. That night, as the house settled, the police called a name at Amanda's direction. They had a lead on the van. They had a plate, incomplete, but enough to send a team. One of the men captured in that sweep admitted to one thing only. They had been paid $50,000 to make Jacob stop answering a call, to make his name disappear from the lists he kept. They had been told the name to erase by a man who called himself indifferent. Amanda's security team suggested a precautionary approach, a discreet patrol around Jacob's home for a week, a quiet arrangement for supplies to be delivered to Mariam, an arrangement to pay for additional medical care should Jacob need it. She authorized it without hesitation, because a small, steady kindness could save lives. She did not know then that the exchange that had given her a blind child would also have created a man whose mind worked like a ledger, who measured sacrifices and returns in numbers that didn't match humanity. Weeks earlier, when Philip still slept under the orphanage's thin blanket, there had been a different kind of exchange executed in the humming fluorescent light of a hospital's nursery. The camera angles there were prone to blindness. The surveillance had been spotty, a little too cheap, a patchwork of angles stitched together by shifting needs of a budget. Doctor. Atomy kept his office in the back, where the lights hummed, and he balanced a checkbook and a conscience that had seen many small moral compromises. He had been paid a sum and had accepted envelopes with an efficiency that came from survival, not virtue. He had thought of those envelopes as leverage for his daughter's education. It had been a small space, a moment of decision. Which of 2 infants to place in a bassinet, which baby to bundle and present with a smile. For him, the calculus was simple. A woman pressed for favor, an envelope warm as a new coin. He looked at the faces and made a choice. He did not imagine the flourishing ripple of that choice. He imagined a school fee paid. In the hospital, a nurse had watched him. She had watched the swap, the hand that set one swaddled infant down and took another. as if the body of one baby could be so lightly traded. She had a name. She had shaken her head and given the man the smallest of looks, like a judge who understood the law, but not the small cruelties people believed were their compensation. She had left the nursery and told herself she had no power to change the world. The memory of her hands would return to her many years later in a different light. Back in the present, Amanda had Tom run a sweep at Dr. Adme's office. It was a slow, surgical thing, a careful request for camera footage that would be preserved if anything suspicious had happened, the subpoena process when voluntary sharing failed. Tom's team worked with a detective who had no patience for the callous edges of privileged life, and who nevertheless recognized patterns in bribes when they saw them. They found admissions in bank transfers, small amounts traced to a clinic account. They found discrepancies in the hospital ledger. The pieces were not dramatic. They were patient and bureaucratic, and perfect in their mundanity. And they were enough to justify a more thorough look. For now, the result of that look was a few old faces in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and overpowering coffee. Dr. Adme's hands trembled on his coffee as he was asked to explain missing bassinet logs. He deflected, stammered about memory, claimed confusion. He said such things because everyone being questioned said them at first. The reflexive denial of men who had been cornered. In Amanda's house, when night came again, she paced the study and stared at a frame where an old photograph of a younger Jacob and a much younger version of herself leaned against dust. Philip was not yet in the world of tapestry and names in that image. Peter slept, small and trusting in a manner that unclenched something in her chest. She had not told Peter, could not yet tell him, that a man beyond their home had once been his father, and that she had known that about him and done nothing but raise him like a guardian who kept secrets in both hands. Sometimes she imagined the two boys as parallel tracks, one raised with light and the other with hunger. She imagined the years that separated them like a river that neither expected to cross. She had not imagined the river would be dredged by violence. As the investigation wound through its early days, a thin, difficult light peeled back small portions of truth. A neighborhood camera near St. Mary's had picked up a figure hurriedly carrying a bundle on the night of a lullaby. A nurse, bending into the darkness as if to choose a path. A volunteer who had visited the orphanage 2 nights later remembered a man in a shaky suit paying the director and whispering. The director smiled and pocketed the money. These pieces coalesced into a picture that did not sit right inside Amanda's chest. She requested, through the correct lines and the ones she had paid for quietly, an archivist to pull any surveillance from the general hospital for the nights surrounding a date she had almost never known to ask about. Pushing for records required patience. It required the kind of attention that was her default and that most others found exasperating. The archivist called with a single line at midnight and a phrase that made the hair at her nape rise. "We have footage with missing timestamps." Tom's team had hooked into the hospital's archaic DVR system. It took hours to coax the files into life, to make the footage visible beyond the static array of a camera that had been designed to watch corridors, not morality. The footage played in her study on a screen that bathed her face in the clinical glow of the hospital. It was not cinematic. It was static and honest. The nursery seemed a small planet of whistles and glass. Nurses moved like seasons. There was the clatter of keys, the hum of fluorescent lights. The clip Amanda watched in the slow, reeling way a person watches a wound close up showed Dr. Adme's silhouette near the bassinets. He stood in a way that did not look like the posture of a man who had long ago reconciled his choices. There was a woman in the corner with a cart who looked tired. She paused and handed a receipt to the doctor. He looked down, and then, in a movement so ordinary it broke something inside Amanda, he took an infant from one bassinet and settled him next to another. The hands were efficient. A nurse came around the stroller. Hands that were practiced, and then, for a fraction of a breath, hesitant. A soft envelope changed hands under the din of a baby crying. Amanda watched and felt the air leave her. There was no melodrama in the image. There was the banal cruelty of a transaction. The infant, whose white blanket tucked like a flag into the cradle of the camera, blinked and slept as if nothing crucial had shifted in the world. Another infant, darker-skinned and with a small curve of a mouth that would become familiar later, was lifted and wrapped. Someone had chosen them as if choosing produce. Tom's voice was quiet on the speaker when Amanda asked him for an opinion. "The timestamps are off," he said. "But the pattern matches points where there is an unexplained change in the logs. This looks like a swap." Amanda felt the universe slip like a misplaced stitch. It was a possibility she had hated imagining, and yet one she had always held as a small, aching suspicion. She had wondered why Peter was blind, why a child with those particular eyes had been given to her, why the other child might have been left without the advantages the world would provide. If this was truth, then the consequences would not be simple exchanges of names. Lives would rearrange as if a house of cards had been breathed upon. She did not call anyone, not yet. She did not awaken Peter with the noise of revelation. She sat and let the gravity of the footage settle. She had enough to do the thing that mattered: follow the money and follow the paper trail. If a man had accepted an envelope and swapped two infants for reasons of coin or revenge, then a man could be found who had the ledger of that exchange. Somewhere between the hospital footage and the plate fragments and a runner who feared the law, the shape of a larger story came into focus. Amanda's knowledge of Jacob, of his roots, his habits, his little rituals, enabled her to be a small force in a larger mechanism that was now starting to move. She could not yet claim paternity for anyone. She could not, under the law, force an acknowledgement of wrong. What she could do was keep someone alive, and she had that power. She did not pretend to be the woman who saved men with a single phone call. She was older than that myth. She was 65, and liable to the kinds of fatigue that made small tasks like filing taxes feel like mountains. She had money, and doors open for her money. She had people who listened when she spoke and recorded when she asked them to. She used them with the guilt of someone who had paid for people to live and had often mistaken transaction for care. The next morning, she drove to the hospital, the car traveling through a city that smelled of diesel and fruit markets. She carried with her a paper bag of things that might make a day easier for a small, bruised family. A care package of foods that would not offend Mariam's senses. Enough cash to tide over a week of medical bills without forcing Jacob to stand in a line. She did it because she had the means to do so, and because small gestures mattered on days like this. Mariam accepted the package with a blank expression and a small, careful gratitude that made Amanda's chest ache. She watched Jacob sleep and briefly thought of truth as a creature with teeth. How cruel would the truth be when it was finally torn free? Would it settle like dust and be swept away, or would it cut like glass? The police found a second man involved in the assault, a driver who had misremembered the plate numbers and thus given a shadow the shape of a face. The driver named a location where men met, an old compound with the kind of bureaucracy that thrives on being ignored. On a rainy afternoon, a team moved in. They flashed badges and called names. A few of the men were cuffed. One of them, a young man who had never been allowed the dignity of a job that paid a living wage, looked as if he had been surprised to find the law on the side of consequence. In the interrogation room, with corners like knives and a clock that read seconds as accusations, one of the men told a name that belonged to Chisum. He said the name as a thing that was at once blasé and offered like a secret that would let him sleep. "Chisum," he said. The officer looked up and wrote it down. It was a name that had been less a detail than a promise. When investigators reached Chisum, they found a man who was used to coercion but unused to scrutiny. He had a small arsenal of excuses and justifications. He talked around the edges of questions, and then, when pressed, offered a small, stupid truth. "We didn't mean for him to get hurt. We were supposed to scare him, make him stop answering the calls." They were trying to frighten a man into silence, as if silence could repair a wrong. The officers listened, and the narrative narrowed to crimes that could be proven: assault, intimidation, conspiracy. Amanda watched the story filter through the legal net and felt the particular humility of seeing the law do the slow work of justice. It was not quick, it was not dramatic, it was careful and therefore credible. Yet the footage from the hospital sat in her study like a sleeping animal. She fed it slowly, piece by piece, to a chain of people who would not let the trickle of evidence dry. A banker who worked with the hospital's accounts flagged transfers to an offshore. A nurse pressed for change, found a receipt, and tucked it into a pocket she later regretted having ever emptied. Dr. Admi sat in his clinic with a temperature of shame. He could not yet see the end of his choices. One evening, when rain sheared across the windows and the house smelled of coffee and paper, Amanda turned to the photograph on the mantel. There were two boys who had been given to two different lives. One slept in a room that hummed quietly with the machine of support and care. One slept in a bed that smelled of something less definable, the need that often forces intelligence to harden into something else. She thought about the costs she had paid to keep a promise to herself and the world, that she would shelter life when life was fragile. For Jacob, the world had reshaped itself into something small and painful. His daughter's tears, the set of Mariam's jaw, the way neighbors looked at him. He kept his head down. He had always believed that secrecy could be shelter. Now he knew secrecy could be a shackle. There was a night when Amanda received a message stamped with urgency. A private investigator had handed over a small scrap of footage from a camera near the hospital that had been out of commission for years, but whose data had been archived. A grainy, off-angle file that contained a moment that mattered. The man on screen had a hand with a scar that Amanda recognized from the old garage. Jacob had that exact small crescent healed on his wrist from a childhood accident. The camera caught a man handing a sealed envelope to a doctor who adjusted the bassinet labels like someone arranging fruit on a platter. The man on the screen was not Jacob. He was another figure. Older, tired, a man who had not expected to be needed again. Amanda watched until the light in the study thinned. She felt something new unfurl, a sense of obligation that had weight beyond money, beyond privilege. She did not yet know how the story would end. She knew only that the men who had punched Jacob in the night had come as a consequence of decisions made years before, when cheap envelopes filled hands that were desperate for a solution. The case would grow teeth in the days to come. For now, the city breathed with a little less complacency. Notes were being filed. Phones were being checked. A hitman, one of the men who had been paid to terrorize Jacob, had been caught for a street mugging and had given a name in exchange for a lighter sentence. He was not the architect of the exchange. He was its foot soldier. Amanda stood and walked to the nursery where Peter slept. She sat and watched him breathe, a small, soft thing oblivious to the machinery of adults. She thought of the two boys side by side, in the way her mind, in that dark quiet, imagined them. One with a mind like a river that would not be dammed, and one with eyes that could be taught to see in other ways. She thought of the small, necessary cruelty of truth. There was no single victory yet. The legal work moved like winter, slow, inevitable, leaving a landscape changed by the melting. There would be arrests, and there would be hearings. There would be a courtroom with lawyers who wore justice like armor. There would be men who would try to excuse their hands with the thinness of hunger. But as the first part of the story closed into its own thin night, one thing was clear. The violence that had been aimed at a poor mechanic had been the outward sign of a deeper business, an exchange of children, of lives, of a family's name for a transaction. Amanda had known Jacob too well to presume the story would be neat. She had the means to push the case forward. She had, for the first time since the hospital footage, a plan that involved protecting the family who had been at the center of the violence. She wrote a check to cover Jacob's medical bills. She arranged for counsel who would help him find a lawyer who would not ask questions louder than the answers needed. She wrote the check, arranged a counsel who would sit with Jacob in neutral rooms and speak only when it softened the raw edges, and she called a detective she trusted to stitch together the paper trail that the city's small cruelties had left behind. The detective was Elias Madhu, tall, with a patience honed by years of watching human expediency crack under pressure. He moved through institutions like someone who understood their language. Subpoenas, chain of custody forms, sworn affidavits. He explained the work to Amanda without theatricality. "We need samples, Ms. Okoro. Blood, swabs. We need original hospital logs, not copies. And we have to secure every piece of footage in a way the court will accept." Amanda listened, as if absorbing a litany. She had money. She had influence. She did not have the one thing Elias needed more than anything: immunity from human error. So they built redundancy into the plan. Elias would work the police channels for warrants and seizures. Tom would use legal teams and private investigators to find threads the public system might miss. Amanda would provide for the immediate needs: medical care, food, counsel, and wait for the slow arithmetic of justice. Jacob signed forms with hands that shook less from pain than from the burden of exposure. He submitted a cheek swab, watched the cotton turn pale in custody bags, listened as an officer read the chain of custody aloud, and initialed each line with the careful boredom that legal process required. Mariam sat in the corridor and thumbed a child's crayon like a rosary, while Helen, who had seen fear tighten her father into small shapes, waited to be called in with the kind of impatience only a child could have for grown things. The lab did the work in its own cadence. DNA is a slow calculus: extraction, amplification, comparison. Elias requisitioned an accredited lab, one that reported to a national registry and whose results could be admitted without question. Amanda paid the invoices without hesitating. The results would not be the only proof, but when they came, they would be a weight the story could not ignore. While the samples were processed, Amanda's investigators continued to move through the guts of the hospital exchange. They found petty ledgers, a spiral-bound book with patient names and columns filled in a hurried hand. They found bank transfers traced through an intermediary account, and tiny envelopes photographed inside a clinic drawer in an administrative audit. A young administrative clerk at the hospital, who had once been intimidated into silence by men who liked their work to be efficient and their payments anonymous, offered to copy files for a fee Amanda paid gladly. The nurse who had seen the swap, long haunted by a small shame and now older with regret, came forward with sworn testimony. She had seen Dr. Admai reach twice toward the bassinets that night, and she discreetly kept a note of the time on a cigarette pack. None of these things by themselves made a law case. Together they formed a lattice: bank transfers, the nurse's statement, the CCTV frames with altered timestamps, and the DNA sample that would either dovetail with or sever the entire hypothesis. Elias built the lattice with the sort of deliberate patience his job required, knowing the court would demand more than gossip or supposition. In the meantime, the danger that had arrived at Jacob's gate did not abate. The men who had been hired to frighten had a habit of seeking closure. One of them, arrested for an unrelated mugging, had talked too easily in exchange for a reduced sentence. He had given a name that led to another name, and another. It was a trail led by caching convenience, and it had a tendency to end up at accounts that could be traced when someone with expertise had the will to pry. That man's information led the team to a transfer pattern. Small drips of cash leapt from an account registered to a front company, and ended in the kind of offshore account the rich use to anonymize their unkindnesses. The transfers were modest compared to the scale of Amanda's typical dealings, but their purpose was precise. Part of Elias's work was to follow these transactions and to identify the person at the center who authorized them. Chisholm's name surfaced repeatedly. He had the arrogance to hand out cash to men whose ethics stopped at the price he offered. He had paid to make Jacob silent. He had paid again, in arguable folly, to keep his hands invisible. Detectives, moving with warrants in hand, made a quiet sweep of a compound where men gathered for work that blurred the line between labor and lawlessness. They seized phones, hard drives, and a ledger with numbers and short annotations. Green, Jacob, 50K, Doc, Bassinet, 10K. Those marginalia had a clumsy honesty to them. It was paper evidence that required coronation by testimony and science, but it was a bridge that could be crossed. There was, however, another thread to be worried about, a sharper edge than thugs who beat and ran. When the man who had been caught for street crimes spoke in exchange for mercy, he muttered a name that did not belong to the petty networks. He said, almost in passing, "There was a cleaner, a hitman, harder to see, paid for silence." The word settled into Amanda's chest like a second distinct worry. The men they'd so far rounded up were capable of cruelty, but not of the kind of professional finality the word implied. A hitman meant skill and detachment, and likely a payment large enough to warrant attention. If such a man had been hired, the stakes were no longer an isolated act of intimidation. They were a targeted attempt at erasure. Amanda's knowledge of Jacob surfaced with terrible usefulness. She knew the corners he frequented, the market stall where he bought second-hand tools, the corner shop where Helen liked the cheap sweets that tasted like summer. Elias proposed a plan that would not put her in harm's way. A police presence placed in the market the day Jacob would go to collect his pay from a mechanic's gig. A marked car nearby. Plainclothes officers dispersed among vendors. Amanda agreed. She offered the security team discrete camera feeds she could access, not to circumvent the law, but to feed it with data that would protect a man she had known for decades. On a humid Tuesday, Jacob walked to the market with a limp he did not like to show. He moved the way people do when they think there is nothing waiting for them beyond work. Careful, habitual, barely dreaming. He had not been told that a protective sweep would be in place. Elias had chosen to let him live in ignorance to preserve whatever dignity the man could hold. The operation was as anonymous as possible. No armored cars, no public fanfare. Men in plain clothes positioned themselves near stalls. A vendor whose trust Amanda had cultivated years ago agreed to watch a corner and to alert if anything looked wrong. A figure detached itself from the shadows near an alley where vendors stored crates. He was not the kind of person who bought fish and weighed the dice on a hand. His clothes fit too cleanly. His gait was too economy-trained for the neighborhood. He moved toward Jacob with the kind of purpose that ruins ordinary nights. But the man had not known that Amanda had paused in her study and keyed a comms line to a small tactical unit. He had not known that the license plate that had been partially recalled by a shopkeeper had been compared to a database Amanda's team had access to, leading to a vehicle with recent modifications used in other transits. The hitman reached for the small black object he carried, slim, professional, and a plainclothes officer tapped his shoulder. He turned too quickly, and in that fraction of a moment a second officer moved. The hitman shoved at them, and the street flared with the abrupt, graceless violence of an arrest. He cursed, then went limp when his ankle was secured. There was no cinematic gunfight. There was an expert trade gone wrong, and a quiet, efficient law enforcing its limits. Seconds later, as the crowd gathered and murmured, Elias walked up with the man in cuffs. He looked at Jacob with something like grief and something like relief. "No one got hurt worse than had to," Elias said. The man's mouth opened and closed like someone who had been given a sentence to swallow. "He was paid to make you stop answering calls," Elias continued. The hitman spat and said, almost bored, "They told me to make it look like an accident." The arrest made headlines the way small ripples sometimes do in the city, a paragraph in the local morning, a single segment on the evening news. To Amanda, it mattered for different reasons. The man in custody offered names under interrogation, names that pointed closer to the family compound and to the ledger of small payments. Each confession needed corroboration. Each claimed fact required paperwork, witness testimony, bank records. The team moved on the orphanage and on the hospital almost simultaneously. On the orphanage's grey morning, Amanda was in the van with Elias and a social worker. She did not wear the paraphernalia of wealth. She kept her hands in her lap and let the world present itself plainly. Philip, by then almost 6, sat at a table with other children and picked at a biscuit. He looked up when the van arrived, curious and cautious, in the way children are when strangers who carry rigid adult purposes come close. Elias announced the presence of the police with the care of a man trained to respect the fragile nature of children's trust. He presented warrants to the director, who had worn his anxiety like an old coat. The director argued about timing and the costs of disruption, and then, when presented with the court order and the clear voice of law, he relented. The social worker, who had known the children's names for years, knelt and spoke softly to the boys. Philip's eyes, bright with a hunger for facts and possibilities, watched the men in uniforms and the woman who sat quietly and waited with a patience that had an edge. When the police asked for DNA samples from children at the orphanage, child protection protocols were followed. Consent where it could be obtained, court orders where it could not, and the presence of a children's advocate. Philip allowed a swab because the social worker promised him a story about a hero who had lost his way, and his curious mind wondered whether another story might include him. The swabs were taken with specialized kits and logged immediately. For the orphanage administration, it was the start of proceedings they had never expected to face. Amanda watched Philip from across a small room where toys lay as if waiting for decisions. She felt in that moment the old, complicated ache of being the possible owner of a wrong she had not yet admitted. She wanted to hold his smallness and apologize without words, but she kept the distance of someone who understood that guilt, without action, can be spectacle rather than remedy. The hospital moved into legal mode as well. Elias and a court officer took a copy of the hospital's archived footage and had a forensic team extract the original files with the proper hash signatures for admissibility in court. Chain of custody forms were affixed to each hard drive. Dr. Admi was subpoenaed. Under the pressure of legal scrutiny and the weight of evidence that made a tidy noose of his past choices, he began to speak. His first words were evasive. Then, when faced with the nurse's testimony and the bank transfers, he told a story reduced to survival and shame. He admitted to accepting envelopes but did not at first confess to an intentional swap. He spoke of the hospital's chaos, of nights when staffing was thin and decisions were made with an eye to administrative speed. But the nurse's testimony, supported by the CCTV that showed his hands moving between bassinet and bassinet in a time frame that made the swap plain, combined with the ledger of transfers, hardened the prosecution's case. The money did not speak on its own. It had to be connected by the man who had taken it. Court filings were made. Charges of kidnapping, trafficking of a minor, conspiracy, and medical malpractice. Amaka's name began to anchor in those filings as documents were compiled. A transfer of funds, traced through a front, and connected to her account by a paper trail that had small telltale gaps, but enough correspondence to be suspect, appeared in the prosecutor's exhibits. The ledger included notes in a handwriting that could be compared. The handwriting analyst found lines that suggested Amaka's pen. When Amaka was brought in for questioning, she sat with a coldness that had always been part of her armor. On the surface, she argued practicality and survival. Amanda had had everything handed to her, and Amaka, had been the one required to build advantages for her sons. In her voice, there was the crispness of someone who had manufactured moral arguments out of scarcity. "I gave them an opportunity," she said at one point, as if that explained a swap that had cost a child years of different possibilities. But inside her, the ledger was not neat. She had been bad at the details in ways she had not wanted to be. She had miscalculated the long arc of consequences. She had imagined that the orphanage would be a place where a child could be found and educated, and that her sons would prosper with the social capital she believed they deserved. She had not imagined that the child she had given away would become a mind that counted her absence as a debt, and would, in time, be capable of putting that debt into words that spoke of injury. In pretrial hearings, the defense flailed. They argued practicalities, an overwhelmed hospital, memory failure, unprovable intent. The prosecution brought the nurse's testimony, the financial transfers, and the CCTV frame that had become a record of a choice. The city's small papers called it a scandal, and the public murmured about the cruelty of the exchange and the collusion of institutions that accepted small envelopes rather than small lives. Elias pushed for more. He wanted the DNA. He needed to stitch the human claim to a science that courts accept mutely and decisively. The lab delivered its report with the neutrality that made it almost brutal in its insistence. When the matching report arrived, Elias brought it to Amanda in a sealed envelope and urged her to sit. The finding was what the team had quietly expected. The probability of parentage was overwhelmingly in favor of Jacob and Amanda being Philip's biological parents. Amanda held the paper like a relic. She read it twice, then set it down and closed her eyes. Facts do not erase feelings. They only rearrange them. In the quiet of her study, she thought of years of lullabies and of the envelope she had never received, and of the child in the orphanage who had been hungry in ways she had trouble naming. The paper did not excuse the past. It did not absolve her of a lifetime of decisions that were sometimes kind and sometimes avoiding. It only said who the boy was by blood. The revelation reverberated through the case and through the people most affected. Jacob, when told that the DNA matched, felt a sound like a broken thing fall out of him. There was no triumph in that sound. It was a complicated relief. A confirmation that he had not been insane to hold a memory like a small, stubborn stone. A confirmation that the truth he had kept secret had weight. Mariam listened with a face that folded and reformed. She had loved Jacob in a way that had tolerated secrecy until it became a threat. She had stood by him through poverty and long nights, and had built a family on the foundation of what he would reveal and what he would hide. The DNA was a new variable she had to measure. She asked few questions in the beginning. She did not have the breath for interrogation. Her first concern, practical as any mother's, was how this would affect Helen, and how they would keep their daughter safe from headlines and from the gaze of people who liked spectacle. The orphanage was where the reunion occurred, and it was neither neat nor sentimental. Amanda arrived with counsel, a social worker, and an understanding that the law required permission and process. She did not enter acting like a woman reclaiming property. She entered like someone who had been confronted with an outcome her decisions had helped shape. Philip regarded her with the kind of guarded politeness children learn from adults. Polite, but not yet certain. When he learned the truth, Philip did not collapse or leap. He asked questions that could have belonged to a child or a future lawyer. Questions about forms, and if he would still have his friends, and what would happen to the man who kept him. He asked if he could still keep the book the volunteer had given him. Amanda listened and answered with as much honesty as a woman who had mishandled life could muster. She promised to help him find the things he needed, and to be there when he asked. Philip, who had been shaped by hunger into a mind that measured bargains, looked at her with curiosity and something like a gamble. The courtroom proceedings moved with the legal rhythm of evidence and argument. The prosecution laid out a narrative that, taken together, formed a moral indictment. a medical professional who accepted money and then assisted in an exchange that had the effect of putting a child into a world funded by another's privilege. A woman who, motivated by envy and the desire to secure outcomes for her own line, had authorized actions that amounted to trafficking and conspiracy. A nephew who had used coercion and payments to silence a father. And a group of hired men who had applied brute force to erase an inconvenient link. The defense tried to humanize the accused. They produced testimony about poverty and the strain of necessity. But the ledger, the transfers, the nurse's testimony, the hospital footage with its forensic timestamps, and the DNA combined into a narrative that the jury could follow without romance. When the judge instructed the jury, he spoke of law and of the consequences of choices. He did not speak of redemption. That was for later. Amidst the legal motion, Amanda and Jacob met for the first time, without a screen of guilt separating their gestures. They sat long and spoke of the things that had not been said, and of small, almost practical arrangements. How to integrate Philip into a life that would be tender without being intrusive. Jacob asked the one question that lived at the center of his worry. What will you give him? Not things, but truth. Amanda answered in a way she had not been able to answer before. I will give him the truth in full. I will not pretend the past did not hurt him. I will not pretend I did not fail. She placed her hand on his in a gesture that required no flourish. It was a promise and an admission in the same stroke. Their reunion at the orphanage had tender moments that the cameras missed, and one that television would later capture because a volunteer had taken a picture in a bright hall. Philip hesitated at first, then reached to touch Mariam's cheek. Mariam sat like someone learning to forgive under pressure. The touch was not a completion, it was an initiation. Helen watched from the doorway with a child's wary hope, and when Philip smiled, an unpracticed thing of surprise at being offered a second story of belonging, Helen offered him a drawing she had previously made for the man she thought of as a myth. The trials that followed were not quick. Chisholm and Amaka were charged and arraigned. Their riches could not buy the silence the court demanded. Emma, whose complicity had been less public, but evident in bank records and in messages, found herself cornered by a legal system that did not accommodate excuses born of entitlement. Dr. Admi faced both criminal proceedings and the medical board. His license was suspended pending a full inquiry. The orphanage director faced scrutiny for lax oversight. The social worker provided a testimony that painted him as pragmatic to the point of moral impotence, pocketing donations and ignoring the long-term impact. Amanda did not relish the spectacle. She attended hearings when necessary, not to gloat, but to ensure the legal process was respected. She learned that justice is often prosaic rather than majestic. Motions, continuances, plea bargains. Amaka's defense attempted to portray a sister pushed by the world and not by malice. That line failed because the evidence of active wrongdoing, transfers, the ledger, witness testimonies, pressed too heavily against a narrative of survival alone. The jury found Amaka guilty on charges that included conspiracy to commit kidnapping and trafficking, and Chisholm and Emma were convicted for their parts in the conspiracy and the intimidation. Part of the sentencing included restitution and mandated community service for some defendants, where appropriate. But largely the sentences reflected the gravity of choosing to trade a child's future for a perceived personal advantage. The court's language was sober. Crimes of betrayal were not small things. The legal consequences did not erase their choices, and they did not restore lost years to Philip. They served to mark state recognition of the harm done. In the quieter moments after the verdicts, Amanda walked a different corridor altogether, the long business of repair. She could not give back years to Philip. She could give him, instead, guardians who would not treat his life as an accounting problem. She hired a child psychologist who specialized in attachment disorder and resilience in children who had been displaced early and asked for guidance rather than miracle cures. She funded educational support and found a small school with a teacher who liked the way Philip read and pressed at his curiosity. For a man who had always bought possible solutions, this work was humbling. It was not about purchase, but patience. Peter's presence remained a tender constant. Amanda kept him close, because his innocence was not linked to the lie that had produced a crime. He had been loved and cared for, and deserved the same stability as any child. She did not attempt to root Peter out of the home he knew. Instead, she made room. Philip came for supervised visits that became unsupervised when the social worker's reports were consistently positive. For Peter, the arrival of a stranger who claimed a bloodline did not erase the woman who had fed him lullabies. A slow lesson about the plurality of family began between the two boys. Family was not a single story. Jacob and Mariam, meanwhile, navigated the new terrain with a caution that sometimes appeared as coolness. Mariam's trust had been wounded, not by Jacob's biology, but by the absence of a truth that had been a shadow over their marriage. They went to couples counseling, where small communications were treated as fragile and important. Jacob's guilt took forms she could see. He became overprotective, shadowed, attempting to fix things that could not be fixed. Mariam would sometimes say something small, a request for honesty about where he worked or how he slept, and Jacob would respond with a steadier, measured transparency. It was not forgiveness in a moment, it was a process. The men who had beaten Jacob and the hired hitman were sentenced for their crimes. The court record became a public ledger that chronicled the harm done, and the sentences, while not erasing the past, established boundaries. The legal resolution did not eliminate the possibility of retaliation. Chances are, people who had paid for violence might feel the law's teeth and crave retribution. But the arrests broke the immediate network that had organized the intimidation. Even so, in the final scenes of the public drama, there remained an undercurrent of secrecy. A marker, in the stark private space of the prison visiting room, showed a shrewdness that had not been broken by the verdict. When Amanda visited, required by a court order as much as by Amanda's own desire to face the architect of the damage, Amarka looked smaller in the fluorescent light, and yet she still met Amanda's gaze with a calculation that unsettled. "You thought silence could be purchased," Amarka said, not with the bitterness of a woman crushed, but with the cold reasoning of someone who had long justified harm as transaction. "You thought the world would balance itself if you paid the right people. It doesn't matter now whether you are richer. We are still here," Amanda answered simply. "You were given a choice to do better. You chose not to." There was no victory in the statement. Amanda kept her composure not to act like a queen, but because the work of care required steadiness. Amarka's confession in the meeting room carried the heavy weight of old resentments. She said she had wanted security for her sons, that the system had taught her to believe advantage mattered more than consequence. She blamed poverty and the way the city taught the desperate to look for immediate solutions. Yet she also admitted a small, unvarnished truth. She had been envious of Amanda's detachment from need and had wanted to ensure her own family's inheritance of opportunity. The complexity did not redeem the crime, but it explained how someone sane could stitch choices into villainy. Amanda left the prison without exultation. There were no dramatic confrontations, no cinematic unmasking. There was only a sober knowledge that a woman she had once called sister had committed a crime that would be marked on their family forever. The court had done its work, and the law had its sentence, but the moral calculus required more than conviction. It required a willingness to live with the ambiguous cost of choices. In the months that followed, Philip's brilliance came to matter in the ways everyone had suspected. He read voraciously and taught himself multiplication by measuring out biscuits and trading scraps like tokens. He liked puzzles and the rules that made systems predictable, math and mechanics. He began tutoring at a small foundation Amanda funded. The woman who ran that foundation, a retired teacher who preferred children to boardrooms, discovered in Philip the kind of resilient humor that survived the meanest hunger. Helen and Philip developed a silence that had the shape of a negotiation. Sometimes they argued over a toy. Sometimes they sat together and built towers from cardboard. Helen loved the idea of having another boy around. She loved the idea that family could expand in a way that did not deny her place. Mariam came to accept Philip as part of the household infrastructure, not as an erasure of their history, but as an addition that required care. There were public reckonings and private ones. Amanda made public statements that acknowledged the part of the system she had benefited from. She set up a fund for hospital oversight and for improving adoption transparency. The fund aimed to correct in institutional ways the small holes through which the envelope system had flowed. It was not a complete answer. It was an attempt to make the world less likely to be exploited. But justice has a side that is quieter. The ongoing care, the reluctant reconciliations, and the slow habit of being accountable. Jacob, who had once measured himself by silence, started speaking in small ways. He learned to let others run errands for him. He accepted a job arranged by Amanda's counsel at a small workshop funded by a neighborhood initiative the Billionaire supported. Not as charity, but as a means of sustenance that would let him rebuild pride unshorn by secrecy. The city, for its part, turned the case into a conversation about how the vulnerable can be preyed upon by both poverty and the corrupted practices of otherwise respected institutions. Hospital rotations tightened. A committee reviewed protocols. An anonymous doctor at another hospital anonymously wrote to a column about the pressures that had made Dr. Admi's choices conceivable. Public debate was messy and sometimes performative, but it did prod institutions into action. And yet, even as cases closed and the city adjusted, there remained the particular human residue of what had been done. Philip carried an ache for years he could not get back. Helen would sometimes wake up from nightmares about the men in masks. Jacob would occasionally stare at his thumbnail through a long day and remember a door that had been broken open. Amanda, who had once thought of herself as a woman who could remedy with funds and curated programs, learned to accept that some things required less transactional and more sustained human presence. In private, Amanda sometimes sat upstairs in the house and watched both boys asleep at different times. She listened to the rhythm of their breathing and felt both the weight of guilt and the pull of a renewed purpose. There was no attempt to return to an uncomplicated morality. She had failed in the past by assuming that giving money equaled rightness. Now she attempted something harder, consistent, sometimes messy caretaking that insisted on accountability. One late night, a year after the arrests, Amanda received a postcard from a woman whose letterhead she had once funded. It contained a small, precise report from the medical board. Dr. Admi had had his license revoked, and a recommendation had been made for mandatory ethics training for the hospital staff. The note closed with a line Amanda expected and had in some ways feared. These systems will not protect against every greedy choice, but they make such choices harder. Amaka, in prison, found new audiences. Women who looked at her as a cautionary tale or as someone who had fallen for the currency of entitlement. She did not repent in a way that absolved her. She argued, to anyone who would listen, that she had tried to give her children what the world taught was necessary: leverage. She did not meet Amanda's gaze with the humility needed to heal. Yet even in jail, Amaka's presence hinted at a continuity of threat. Her letters, monitored and read by lawyers and by Amanda's counsel, contained small phrases that worried the security team. Cryptic notes about unfinished business and friends who still remember our arrangements. Amanda did not want to imagine further violence, and so she used law and caution, restraining orders where possible, surveillance adjustments, and careful monitoring of those who had been convicted alongside Amaka. The police, now well versed in the network, had no appetite for missing links. They expanded investigations into those who had been only marginally involved. Months later, one of Amarka's associates, a small-time money manager who had helped launder transfers in the original scheme, was found to be moving funds again. It was a tiny, flagged transaction that set off alarms. That man was arrested before he could organize anything larger. The pattern was clear. When actors tried to recreate old mischief, the institutional checks were stronger because of the case they had been forced into. The world had not been fixed, but it was less hospitable to the old practice. The hitman who had been arrested at the market gave long, laconic testimony under the promise of a lighter sentence. He named men he had been paid by and described a scale of professional indifference that made even seasoned officers wince. His final confession, given in exchange for leniency, implicated a small network that had been part of the wider criminal infrastructure, men who provided muscle for pay. It did not, however, implicate the more comfortable tiers of society whose envelopes had made such networks possible. Those lines remained hard to prove. In quiet evenings, with Philip now integrated into the household, Amanda sometimes read to both boys. Philip liked numbers and puzzles and would often ask why odd things happened. Peter loved the cadence of a voice and would hum along with a poem. Amanda learned to hold both boys' stories without needing to rewrite the past. They were two people whose lives had been altered by the same transaction, and now they lived under the same roof with adults who were learning to be present. One afternoon, in the study where once Amanda had watched cold footage alone, she invited Jacob and Mariam to sit with her around a battered coffee table. They talked not of legalities, but of the day-to-day logistics, school schedules, medical appointments, the small pain of sleep interrupted by nightmares. Jacob spoke of wanting to teach Philip how to fix a carburetor in the way his father had taught him, something straightforward and honest. Philip listened and smiled at the idea of learning a craft where logic gave way to muscle. Mariam said nothing grand. She asked for boundaries and for a respect that would ensure her daughter did not fade into someone else's narrative. Amanda agreed. She made a small, practical offer. Every Friday, a family meal where no courts, no lawyers, no reporters would be allowed. A time to be ordinary. The offer was small, but vital in a life that had been public property for a season. There were nights when Amanda thought about future threats and how to guard against them without becoming a woman who built walls so high she forgot how to let life in. She adjusted the house's security modestly, stopped certain deliveries from being public, and instructed her team to monitor chatter. She did not want to live in paranoia. She wanted to live in the modest courage required to open a door to two boys while protecting them from the remains of a conspiracy. And yet a single uneasy detail lingered. Amarka, even behind bars, had friends who remembered ways of making things go away. Amanda knew she would never eliminate all risk. She had long learned that the world refuses finality. There would always be choices that men and women would make in a private calculus. The only leverage she possessed was persistence, to keep pressure on institutions, to fund oversight, to provide the serenity of constancy for children who had once been currency. In the final courtroom scene before sentencing, Amarka spoke directly. Her voice was steady, not penitent. "I thought I was defending my children," she said. "I thought if I acted, I could give them a future." The judge, reading the file, spoke of consequences and the harm done. A careful, formal ledger of injury that would stay on records and shape lives. Outside the courthouse, as cameras blinked and the city absorbed another moral lesson, Amanda walked away with Jacob and Mariam. They did not need press statements. They needed groceries and a place where their daughter's drawings could hang on a wall without reason to fear. Philip, for his part, was in a reading group at a library Amanda had helped fund. He waved to them from inside, his face lit with the kind of ease that has been earned by small victories. Amanda had not been a savior. The law had not been an all-powerful God. They had been instruments in a larger, messy human process that delivered consequences and imperfect remedies. They had, between them, provided a net that caught a boy who had been dropped into a life not of his choosing, and gave him the chance to become himself. On a humid night, years later, Amanda sat on the porch with the two boys asleep inside. She felt the house breathe the way all human inventions do when they are at rest. Her life had been reconfigured by an event she had once allowed to remain secret. She had become, through an uneven and painful arc, someone more exposed to human need than she had ever imagined. That exposure had become a kind of humility. She kept watch not because she feared another hitman would come in the night, though the watchful part of her never fully went away, but because children needed someone steady, someone who would answer their questions without hiding. She had learned that wealth without accountability is a brittle thing, and that redemption is not a dramatic conversion, but a long, steady series of daily acts. There remained an unresolved corner, a note discovered months after the conviction, folded inside a book that had once belonged to a marker. It contained a scribble, an address, and a name, small traces of a network that had not been fully severed. Amanda handed the note to Elias, and he filed it into a stack of pending investigations. It did not change the pleasures of the night. It only kept the city honest about the fact that justice is measured in maintenance as much as in verdicts. In that way, the story did not end. It moved into the long, necessary work of care and repair. The hitman who had targeted Jacob had been stopped because the wealthy woman who had once kept a secret could finally choose to be present. That choice did not erase the past or the sorrow it created. It created instead a fragile new architecture, a family grown by necessity, a legal system that had merits and flaws but had acted, and a city that had been forced to look at the cracks institutions use to hide their failures. Amanda placed a hand on the back of a chair, feeling its grain with the quiet attention of someone who had been taught to mind small things. She thought of the boy who had grown under fluorescent lights and the boy who had grown in a mansion. She thought of the woman who had chosen greed and of the men who had been hired to inflict pain. She thought of the way the city had become, for a time, a crucible where choices burned away pretense and left only the work of living. In the house, a child in the next room shifted in sleep and hummed the perpetual small song Amanda had once made for a blind boy. It was a melody that had been used to soothe and to create a rhythm of care. She allowed herself that small, private smile, and then she rose and walked to the window to look at the street below, where the city kept its watch. The lights blinked in patterns only the attentive understood, and Amanda felt the particular kind of exhaustion that is born of having done what could be done, and knowing there will be more to do tomorrow. If a marker still harbored plans, the law and the ceaseless vigilance of those left in the light would have to meet them. Amanda would not relax into triumph. She had learned the lesson of complicity too well. But she would continue to supply what was needed: counsel, schooling, warmth, even when those things arrived as small, unglamorous acts. The world had given two boys different starts. The rest of their lives would be the work of choosing, of being asked to forgive and be forgiven, of laboring to make broken things bind again. Amanda had known Jacob too well and for too long. That knowledge had saved him from an assassin's hand and had also led to a confrontation with her own past. In that collision, a family was remade. If there was a final image to keep, it was not of verdicts or headlines, but of a nightlight on, in a small bedroom where two boys lay sleeping, the shadows soft at their edges. Amanda sat on the steps outside, hands folded, listening to the quiet city. She had turned the knowledge of a man's habits into protection, and in that moment, after all the legal weight and the moral reckoning, she kept watch simply because someone needed her to, and because at 65 she had finally learned that having power without sustained human responsibility was a greater crime than any single poor choice. If you want to follow how their lives unfold and what new questions the past might yet raise, subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell us what you think Amanda should do next for these boys.